Once, when Pete Candler was teaching at the University of Texas, a colleague came up to him and whispered in his ear, "Candler." He said, looking around nervously, as if fearing someone might hear. He also whispered, "I know what that name means." Puzzled, Pete looked back at him and said, "Well, maybe you can explain it to me then." Pete Candler is a writer, he's a photographer, he's a filmmaker, and now based in Asheville, but he has very deep roots in this city, where his family settled nearly 200 years ago. And I just want to say, because journalism is my field, and I love writing, and I love reading, I think you're about to hear a person that I consider one of the finest, if not the finest, Southern writers of his generation. That family story, the Candler family story may well be known to many of you and many others in this town, and a sort of Reader's Digest edition of that story passed down to Pete. He grew up with bullet points about his ancestors, and only a kind of happy accident led to a search by Pete for a deeper look at those stories behind the versions of history that he had heard. He has been photographing and writing about the American South for over 25 years, and is both a passionate advocate of this region's virtues and a passionate critic of its vices. He approaches the subject of the South in a very personal way, and his work is marked by a profound honesty about his family's past and their tendency to sometimes suppress their own family in ways that you will learn tonight if you haven't already. His work is really driven by a desire to avoid intellectualizing or lecturing, but he aims instead to lead always to the question, what does this have to do with me? In addition to being an artist, Pete is a scholar with 2 graduate degrees from the University of Cambridge, one of the finest research institutions in our world. In Cambridge, he developed a particular aptitude for and love of research, and he brings to his written work the highest level of expertise in deep historical work. Pete also has an irrationally large vision of his own by reaching for broad and deep narratives that help us understand who we are. He also understands that the work he is doing on public and personal memory and forgetfulness in the South possesses a significance that extends well beyond his home region, and which is relevant, I think, for all of us Americans. Pete wants his work to tell a uniquely American story, and he imagines himself as belonging to that great tradition of American writers and artists who try to amplify the often neglected sides of our past and present to the enrichment of our collective self-understanding. As a writer, Pete's work has been praised by artists of the stature of Roseanne Cash, and I hope you'll see she writes the foreword to this book. And his recent photography collection, The Road to Unforgetting, has been praised by Sally Mann, one of the country's greatest living photographers. The Beard Award, writing culinary and cultural historian Michael Twitty has described Pete as an important voice in the discussion of Southern culture and history. And then there's Pete's film work, like his still photography in black and white, which is born out of experience in bringing a particular place at a particular time and focusing on what that experience can teach us. Again, as you think about tonight, focus on ourselves and the world we think of. I think Pete has a discerning and exacting eye, and his work has a natural aesthetic and philosophical affinity with some of the great photographers of the WPA era. Some of you may have fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and others who were very much a part of the WPA era. I certainly do. Pete brings a national story down to a personal level and connects readers in a very concrete way to the personal implications of America's history, connecting his own vices, and yes, he has some of those, to a very real history. A Deeper South could be potentially a defining work of American letters by attempting to see a self through a place and by turning a haphazard road trip into a deliberate search for meaning and even oneself in the beautiful and tortured landscape of our American South. So Pete presents A Deeper South as an invitation to you, for you to connect personally and not merely intellectually to the story of American history and to ask an unpopular question of each reader. What does this and this night, but what does this have to do with me? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pete Candler. Thank you. Help me down. Got it. Thank you. I know many of you came for the introduction. I apologize for being a little long.
I honestly don't know what to say after that. So, but y'all came out. It was all right. It was no, seriously, that was beyond generous. And now I feel like I have a lot to live up to. So I hope this doesn't suck. I thought I would just start by reading a little bit of this book, and after that, my friend Adam Copeland and I will have a little conversation about some issues that pertain to it. First of all, I mean, thank you for being here. I'm just overwhelmed with how many of you there are, and thank you for coming out on a Wednesday night to listen to me read. This is from one of the opening sections of the book called Steak Dinners and Grady Moments. I was a 24-year-old graduate student at an English university, fresh-faced and out of place, when I met my first Canadian over a steak dinner. At least I assumed it was steak. The meat and potatoes dinner meal was what one would expect in England, cooked for too long and with little inspiration. I had known enough about England to anticipate that much, but I had never had enough interaction with Canadians or the idea of Canadians to have any expectations of them. They simply never entered any discussion of any kind in my youth in Atlanta, Georgia. I am sure there were Canadians about then, but I hadn't ever heard one speak a word of any language until the one sitting across from me at dinner said, "You know, the thing about America is you can travel everywhere and the accents all sound pretty much the same." I was too busy choking on my aggressively unsalted roast potatoes to protest this outrageous thesis with words. To be fair, had I given any thought to it at the time, I probably would have thought that Canadians all talk the same too, eh? Ignorance, it turns out, is no respecter of geography. It is, however, curable. The only problem is that you have to recognize your ignorance as ignorance if you would like to be cured of it. Within a year of this jarring episode, I shared a house with a different Canadian and quickly came to discover that not all Canadians share such a monolithic view of their neighbors. Canadian number 2 was doing a doctoral dissertation on Anglo-American relations during the Civil War. So despite having traveled 4,000 miles to study theology at a medieval institution, it turned out that I hadn't made it very far from home at all. One of our housemates, who was from the home counties in England, not Canada, often suggested we have a barbecue at the row house we co-rented on St. Luke Street. I tried in vain to explain that barbecue is something that you eat, not something that you host, but it was wasted breath trying to correct an English person on how to use the English language. Instead, I directed my voluntary diplomatic efforts on behalf of my home region to disabusing Canadians, English people, and other Europeans of their New York-centric view of the United States and their apparent prejudicial aversions to the American South. In the inevitable event that you should come to the United States, I tried to persuade them, sure, you should visit New York, but also go see Charleston, Savannah, Mobile even. Everyone goes to New York, but not everyone sees it, of course. More people should visit Savannah and Charleston. Like you, long-lost Canadian linguist friend, you should definitely visit Savannah. Then you would stop saying that all Americans talk the same. Defensiveness is often the default position of Southerners, especially when they find themselves outside of the South, assuming the role of ambassadors for their region against the prevailing prejudices against the place, often correcting unbelievably durable misconceptions by exaggerating the region's best qualities with an almost religious fervor. But both postures reflect a basic, it's not what you think sort of approach. If even supremely tolerant and overeducated Canadians are prone to these prejudices, then no one is safe from them. And defensiveness was the posture I assumed when faced with what was clearly an empirically falsifiable theory. You should see Charleston, I said. I thought I knew then what I was actually recommending. Had I myself ever actually seen Charleston? It's possible that in talking up the South's most photogenic cities to my Canadian and English friends, I was succumbing to a temptation as dangerous as ignorance, the desire to be taken seriously, as if to say, look, we have beautiful 18th century planned cities too, trees older than Keith Richards. Hey, we also drink tea and an air of refined antiquity that will not only surprise you but make you feel right at home. Why is it so important to you that a tourist feel at home in the South? I failed to ask myself at the time. Was the impulse wrong? Where did it come from? The South, I would come to know later after spending at least 2 decades wandering around its less traveled roads, might not feel quite so homely to an English or Canadian person or even a Southerner. Many visitors come here looking for something they have already seen, whether in a movie or in an in-flight magazine. What many seek is often some version of the Tara myth, an idealized and whitewashed and domesticated rehash of the Old South that makes for attractive book covers and postcards and blockbuster motion pictures, if not for self-informing history. All of which might amount to little more than a toothless fancy were we Southerners not so obliging in catering to market demand for such manufactured nostalgia, or if we didn't invent the myth in the first place. At the time of my apologia for Charleston and Savannah, I had not seen that much of the South myself, and my suggestion that others do so was founded on pretty slim lived experience. Perhaps I was simply confirming the Tara myth to them, replacing one tabloid version of my region with another. So after the presumably steak dinner, I returned to my spectacularly unfurnished room, silently bemoaning the ignorance of my Canadian colleague, sublimely oblivious to the depth of my own. I knew enough about my native region to balk at the idea that there is only one American accent, but I remained as yet unhaunted by the brooding phantasms of history, my regions, my cities, my families, my own. Thanks for coming. Good night. When I knew we were going to have this event here in Atlanta and at the Atlanta History Center, which is one of my favorite institutions in the world, there was one person I wanted to be in conversation with, and that was my friend Adam Copeland, who I've known for too many years to count. But let's just say it's been a long time. We went to high school, junior high and high school together, and Adam is now the director of the Fine Arts program at Westminster. And please give him a warm welcome, Adam Copeland.
Hello, everybody. I am going to throw Pete a bunch of questions, some of which I warned him about, and some of which will come as a total surprise. And the hope is that in doing so, we learn a little bit more about the book and his point of view. So I'd like to start out. There's an incredible story in the book, Pete, that I really resonated with about the experience from our era of going to Stone Mountain Park. And you talk about teenagers heading there, lying on the field, watching the laser show, and there being this huge disconnect about what the place is historically and represents, and what our blissful ignorance of the place was at the time. And I was wondering if you could start us off by telling a little bit about that part in the book, and then also kind of using that to talk a little bit about some of the bigger themes that you consistently get at in it.
Yeah, so like many people in this room, during summers in Atlanta, one of the fun things to do was to go to the laser show. How many of you have been to the laser show? I mean, almost everybody, so I don't need to explain this to you. But if you were, let's just say, like, try this experiment in front of your mirror when you get home. Like, try to explain the laser show to the mirror. And it's impossible. But, so, I mean, you all know the laser show experience, and I have the vivid memory of some film photographs of some people in this room out on the big lawn in front of the world's largest Confederate monument. Of course, that's not how we understood it at the time. It was just like a huge rock with a carving of 3 Confederate dudes. I'm not sure if even then most of us could have identified who they were. But it was one of those experiences that later I would repeat over and over again when we were first doing these road trips, which was just take for granted that these things are there. They're just part of the landscape. I mean, if you can't like ask questions about a 500-foot or however big it is terving of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Jefferson Davis, then something has gone terribly wrong. But the laser show, as I went back to revisit it while writing this book, and I could, between reconstructing my memory of the show and what I could find archivally, it was a perfect example of the kind of sanitization of the lost cause, of the mythology of the South fighting this noble, virtuous, even religious holy war against these infidels, and who only defeated by superior power, not by superior virtue, and so on. But basically, and there's a scene in the laser show, I don't know if you remember this, where Robert E. Lee takes the sword. I mean, this was like asteroids level graphics. It was really, really terrible. But, I mean, it seemed cool at the time. So he like takes the sword and breaks it over his knee, and it shatters into like 3 different pieces. And these pieces of the sword like reconstitute themselves as the different states in the Union. And so all of which is to say, this was basically a noble sacrifice in service of national unity, which is kind of the version that I think a lot of us got. And to be honest, that was my approach. The first sort of series of tours my friend John Hayes and I did, starting in '97, we didn't ask questions about Confederate monuments because they're just there. So as I said, like if you can't do that of Stone Mountain, you're not going to do it of the one in Oxford, Mississippi, or the two in Oxford, Mississippi. So anyway, that was something that only probably 20 years later did I kind of have the eyes to see, okay, these things actually have a history, and the Confederate monument on Stone Mountain has a history, which is pretty fascinating if you're not familiar with it. You will be when you finish reading the book.
So that idea of being in a place, having a kind of amnesia about it, and then going deeper into the history is a big pattern in the book. And I'm wondering if you can give us, my wife was an editor at Publishers Weekly when I first met her, and she helped me see that there's kind of a formula to their book reviews. And right up at the top, they have what is the genre of this book? What kind of one or two sentences of what is it about? What is it? And who's the audience for it? And maybe pretty quickly, what is it referencing? What are some models? What is it like? So I'm wondering if you could sort of give us your own first paragraph of the Publishers Weekly review, if you will, about A Deeper South. What is it? Who's it for? What are some other things that it's like?
It is written in the form of a geographical journey, but it is really a kind of interior journey into my own ignorance. I guess that's the simplest way to put it. And a kind of confrontation with what I don't know. I've come to think of this book as, I think it was a number of writers talk about how a writer is really just a witness, and a prophet is someone who testifies to what they have seen. I am obviously not a prophet, but in this book, I think I try to testify to what I have not seen, and that is, that's animated by just the sort of brute fact of really not knowing much of anything, and realizing that I knew far less than I thought I did. The book was written for 4 people, my children, Henry, Charlie, Oliver, and George, and as you'll see, like it was really an attempt to ensure or to try to make possible for them a future that is less burdened with illusion, self-deception, mythology, falsehood than my own has been. And so they were really the audience for this book. Initially, of course, I began to write this more for I guess people like me, sort of white people who grew up with a kind of fake version of history that is comforting but completely illusory and self-serving. And so I guess like the broader audience was, white Southerners, and then white Americans, and then of course it's written for the whole world. No, it's that's really, it's really kind of aimed at a white readership, because I think that's where I'm coming from, and I think that's who I had in mind. In terms of analogs, this is going to sound totally pretentious, but one of the books that I think is probably the single greatest influence on me, and it's probably hard to detect in this book, is The Confessions of St. Augustine, written in the late 4th century. And I think what it is it's often described as a first biography, but it's an accounting of Augustine's own life from sort of a period of middle age, and looking back and with just brutal honesty. And he does this, and it's called the Confessions because he's written as a prayer. He's offering his life to God, with all of the everything's exposed. You know, it's completely it's edited, but his whole self is there on display.
As a side note, you might want to tell people some of your bona fides around St. Augustine.
Oh well, I guess I read. Do you mean like?
It was mentioned that Pete has a PhD in theology, and it would be fair to say that Augustine is one of your areas of expertise.
I mean, areas of expert. I've read a lot of Augustine. I don't know if I would call myself an expert, but he's certainly, yes. I did study Augustine as an academic, and taught him as an academic. And I think one of the reasons why he's really stuck with me is because the reality of this person is so palpable in the Confessions. I mean, here's an individual who is just letting it all out, and I found that kind of honesty incredibly refreshing. And the other thing that I took from Augustine was so he does this 9 books of telling his life story, basically bringing it up to the present, and then he makes this abrupt shift in book 10, and he's got this really abstract kind of treatise on memory and the nature of memory. So for me, it was okay, you tell your whole story, and then you have to go back to the beginning, and then from there he goes to the story of creation in Genesis, and the remainder of the book is him sort of trying to unpack the first few days of creation. So my sort of nerdy, scholarly, semi-scholarly take on that was kind of in order to make sense of one's life, you kind of have to go all the way back to the beginning and set it in the sort of context of almost like a cosmic story. And so that's how I read the Confessions. And the part about memory, Augustine was revered in the Middle Ages as the patron saint of memory, because he wrote about it so powerfully in the Confessions, but he also wrote some other treatises that deal with memory as an essential quality of what it means to be human.
Well, we'll come back to Augustine in a bit, but you come from a very storied Atlanta family. The Candler name is on parks and buildings, et cetera, all around here. And one of the things you talk about in the book is that you had, from your point of view, a relatively shallow understanding of who they were. And I was wondering if you could explain what you mean when you said you understood them sort of like characters in the board game Clue. So,
yeah, but make sure everybody gets the Clue reference. Do you Clue? Remember Clue? Yeah. So
right.
What were the Colonel Mustard or whatever?
Professor Plum, Miss Scarlet, you know.
So the ancestors that I learned about growing up were there were a handful of them. They were the judge, who was my great. I'll just give you the names first, and then I'll fill in the blanks a little bit. The judge, the bishop, Asa, and the governor. I think that's basically it. And that's these dudes who supposedly did some important stuff. I don't know. And so the judge, the bishop, and Asa were 3 brothers. And my great-great-grandfather was the judge, whose name was John Slaughter Candler, which is really friendly sounding name. But I mean, what are you gonna do? It's family. So, and then his older brother was Warren Aiken Candler, who was bishop of Georgia, Methodist bishop, and he's the one that the seminary at Emory, the School of Theology, is named for him. And then Asa is, if anybody knows any of these people, it's Asa, because he was involved with Coca-Cola, and was mayor of Atlanta. It was kind of, he was sort of a big deal. But the 3 of them were pretty close to one another. So, for example, when the judge's son was born, he was named Asa Warren after his 2 brothers. he was the major, by the way. And so the major, the judge, the bishop, Asa, and then the governor was a first cousin of those guys who grew up in Gainesville. And he's actually one of the main characters in the story because, I knew nothing about these people except that the judge was he was a state Supreme Court justice in the early 20th century. That's basically what I knew. And Allen was a governor same time. Well, that's it.
So there's I know an epiphany that you had in Montgomery that caused you to go a bit deeper. And can you talk a little bit about that and what brought you to kind of look at your family a little bit differently or more closely?
Yeah, so in April of 2018, I had the opportunity to go to Montgomery to write about the opening of the new lynching memorial there for the Christian Century magazine. And in a classic Pete move, I didn't plan ahead, and I got there the day that it was closed. I mean, it was closed on a Tuesday, so, right? That's not normal. And so it was, but the bookstore was open, and I'm sort of naturally attracted to bookstores. So I went to the bookstore that's attached to the Legacy Museum, and I'm poking around, and I find this book called At the Hands of Persons Unknown by Philip Dray. Some of you will recognize it. It's basically like the standard treatment of lynching of black people in this country from about 1880 to 1940 or so. And it's on the basis of that research that and other research that a lot of what the Equal Justice Initiative put into the memorial in Montgomery. So I take it back to my hotel room, and I open this book because I got nothing to write about yet. So I'm just like, I'll read this and get to know this subject a little better. And on the first page is this reference to the lynching of Sam Hose in Noonan, Georgia in 1899. And I'd never heard the name Sam Hose until about that time. And I won't go into the details because it's grotesquely violent and disturbing. And if you want to hold on to your idea of the goodness of humanity, I suggest putting it off for a little bit. But anyway, that's the first story in this history of lynching in America. Sam Hose in Noonan, Georgia. Page 2, Governor Allen Daniel Candler, a pro-lynching governor in Georgia. And that's when you sort of the sound of screeching brakes goes through my brain, and you can't even read the history of lynching in the United States without encountering my family name on page 2. And so something, then it began to really dawn on me slowly, I guess, although it was pretty startling at that moment, that something major had been left out of the accounts of my family that I got. So the judge, they were condensed into these little clue characters, like just names, like avatars, like little icons, like the judge, and left out a whole lot of stuff. And this book was basically an attempt to uncover some of that. The irony, though, I will say this, and I think one of the things that became so interesting to me from interesting and troubling as both the inheritor of this and as a kind of researcher and semi-scholarly person was the fact that when I say uncover, that's not really the right word, because yes, the Candler family was they're everywhere in the early 20th century. There was not a day would go by when there wasn't some Candler family person on the front page of the newspaper. So when I was researching all of this stuff about the family history side of it, I wasn't like going deep into some like private locker full of like manuscripts somewhere. This was like newspaper articles, and then there were books. A friend of mine in Asheville, who's a historian, who used to run the Center for the Study of the American South at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, told me about, he pointed me to this book about the Sam Hose case, and he said, yeah, your family comes up in it a lot. And so yeah, the fact that it was all out there, and like other people knew this stuff. Like this was not news to a lot of people. At least people who knew early 20th century Georgia or Atlanta history. But what it spoke to was the extent of the effort it took for generations of my family not talk about this sort of stuff. I mean, the amount of psychological labor that was put into not talking about something that was public knowledge, that took a lot of work. And so it underscored for me just the deliberate quality of it. And I describe it as a deliberate amnesia.
Well, I'd love to ask a little bit more about that. One of the things that Pete does so beautifully in the book is he'll take places that many people in Atlanta or many Southerners would know, and we might take for granted, and then unpack, say, well, you know this place, and then he might describe some of the history around it. And an incredible phrase he uses when describing, as I said to him, you know, Pete, I think you're the only person to use the words metastasizing amnesia and the big chicken in the same sentence. So Pete uses the big chicken in Marietta as a diving off point to talk about some collective Southern amnesia. And I would love for you to tell us a little bit about what this big chicken has to do with the disturbing epidemic that we're talking about. And so both in the specific of the big chicken and what its original name was and what happened around there, and then maybe from there if you could talk a little bit about why you think this both personal and familial amnesia was true, and why you think it's very common here in the South.
Yeah, so everybody knows the big chicken, right? So, I mean, yes? So one person just indulged, raise your hand and say, I've never heard about the big chicken before. Okay.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you, Kentucky.
All right.
The big chicken is this gigantic aluminum chicken.
It's like, why were you struggling?
I mean, I can do metastasizing, but not chicken. Yeah, it's like it's a KFC up in Marietta on like Highway 41, and there's like a huge, like triangular thing. I think it used to be something else, but they turn it into chicken with like the eyes roll and the beak goes like this, and like to everyone in Atlanta, I don't know if this is true anymore, but you measure distances in that part of town by the big chicken. It's like you go, go to the big chicken, you turn left, you go 3 miles down, then 2 miles before you get to the cemetery, turn right, whatever, and then that was a joke. So right. So subtle.
Yes, it was.
It was like the way you measure space was the big chicken, and of course, like it had this history as like a. Was it Johnny Rebs or something now? I can't remember Jim will know, barbecue historian. And it became, like when it became KFC, it became this iconic sort of marker of space. Now, the ironic thing about that...
But I'm just going to pause you to just make sure that lands for a second. we all talk about the Big Chicken, but part of your point was like its very name or the place, it was Johnny Rebs before that.
Yeah.
That got forgotten. Who knew that the Big Chicken was Johnny Rebs?
Johnny Rebs. Yeah. Did anybody? I mean, Jim probably knew that. Maybe the only person in the room. Did somebody of you ever go to Johnny Rebs before it became KFC?
Yeah.
Maybe
And then right around,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about some of the things that happened just a stone's throw.
So yeah, literally a stone's throw away from the Big Chicken was the site of the lynching of Leo Frank in 1915, which is arguably the most important event in Atlanta history that no one ever talks about, at least in school. I mean, so some Southern historians and so forth who know about this. I mean, huge book written about it.
A Broadway musical most recently.
Broadway musical.
But I mean, before you.
And is that true?
Yeah.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Alfred Urry wrote Parade.
I'm sorry, I don't leave home very much or read the paper. That's amazing. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I need to see that. You want to go to?
We'll
New
go to the
York?
theater. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. But
So I didn't know that, but yeah, so it's literally like a stone's throw. Yes, that's correct.
I think part of what one of the patterns in the book, and is this idea that there's a place, it has often a violent history, and people they kind of strip away all of the violence from the history, and then know it by these kind of innocuous or anodyne, oh, the Big Chicken, oh, it's a cute mountain with a laser show, and there's pattern after pattern like that in the book. Pete travels through the South and finds these things and describes them, and then really deeply unpacks the history. And I am wondering, Pete, you talk about this idea of metastasizing amnesia. And you also referenced that was something that was deeply true of your own family life. And also you've been critical of our joint education in terms of what we learned in history. And I wonder for you, what is the source, in your opinion, of this amnesia? What causes it? And so let's start there.
It's both an accident of history and sort of a gift to me as a writer about this subject to be born and raised in Atlanta, because Atlanta has built a reputation and a very successful career on a deliberate amnesia. I mean, everybody knows the motto that Mayor Hartsfield basically gave Atlanta in the 1940s, the city too busy to hate, which sounds really cool until you really think about that for about 4 seconds. Because if you're too busy to hate, you're too busy to love too. You're too busy to do anything else. You're too busy to remember. You're too busy to do anything worthwhile, to be honest. And so I think part of it originates in the culture of Atlanta as a particular kind of place who identifies itself with almost like a hostility to history. And I mean, just think of the not just the motto, but the logo, the phoenix rising from the ashes. I think the phoenix doesn't, I don't know that much about phoenixes, but doesn't remember what lit it up in flames, what caused it to explode in the first place. So it's like this image of a mythological creature who has no history and who comes from, literally just grows back from ashes. And so its past is not only immaterial to it, it's antagonistic towards its past, or it pretends that its past is non-existent. So one is the culture of Atlanta as a kind of and in this sense, I think Atlanta may be the most American city there is, because it was built on an aversion to history, I think, and then its gospel was salvation through commerce. And to be fair, like, that got Atlanta through some tough patches. but it's not really a sort of long-term strategy for mental or spiritual health. So yeah, I think one of the causes would be just, and in that sense, Atlanta is just a microcosm of American culture generally, which I think is it's pretty history averse.
I'll circle back to a few end questions maybe, but we really want to have time for the audience to be able to ask some questions this evening.
So if you have a question, if you'll just raise your hand, I'll come to you with the microphone to make sure that we're able to hear. Oh, I know this isn't a shy crowd.
Over here?
Anyone? Oh.
Well, good evening. I just think more of a comment than a question. I think it's very important and significant, your role at this particular time in this particular jaunt in history. Coming from the family, I'm not from the South, I'm from New York. But, so I guess I'm the enemy, but I do know the history of the Candler family. I mean, I think all over the world, everybody knows that. And I think it's just so important that you're using your artistry to tell this narrative. And that it's just so amazing that you were born in this time, in this place, and to be able to use your art and write this for your children to tell them, hey, listen, yeah, our family's great. They've got all these things named after them, but hey, this is the reality and this is the truth of it. My question was going to be your aha moment, and certainly having been to Montgomery, to the Legacy Museum, and to that Lynching Museum is a very powerful aha moment. So I just want to thank you for writing the book, and hopefully people will be inspired by it. You know, nobody's asking you to apologize for the sins of your ancestors. Nobody, I mean, what can you do? You know what I'm saying? But you use your voice to say, hey, this is my aha moment. And for other American families, I think it's just a powerful moment in history. So thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Hey, Pete. I know you talked about this a little bit at the event last year, but I'd love you guys to discuss, especially with Adam's role as an educator specifically, but what, if you could sort of wave a magic wand and be in charge of some thought leaders in the education world, what could be done to rectify or to chart a different path that was different than it was 30, 40 years ago, and obviously before that, and even now, on this topic?
Wow. So it's another high school dear friend of ours who asked that question. And Van, if I can just read this right here. I literally wrote almost word for word the exact same question for Pete. So we are aligned. This sort of sense of what to do now.
They're both Westminster theater legends, by the way.
Right,
so
well.
they're on a different level. Oh, man, that's a really tough one. I guess, I don't do sort of prescription very well, but I know that my own experience of American history and my own family history has been so deeply enriched by the experience of just being in the place where some of this happened. I mean, because history isn't really about stuff that happened a long time ago. It's really more about the way we talk about stuff that happened a long time ago. I know historians might sort of want to finesse that definition a little bit, but at least in terms of the way public history functions, the way we remember history is as important, if not more important, than sort of what actually happened. So that's not a practical solution. Getting every school kid to go with me and John on a road trip as fun as that would be. But speaking of which, there is an account. One of the more bizarre stories in the book. That's the word I was looking for. In the book is an episode where we were in Selma, Alabama, and at Confederate Circle, the Confederate part of Live Oak Cemetery, which is beautiful, everything you think a place called Live Oak Cemetery might look like. And there's a Confederate cemetery inside of that. And there's this like newish monument to Nathan Bedford Forrest there. It's not 15 years old, put up in 2001. And that was the first time I ever met someone from the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She introduced herself as the president of the Selma chapter. A very interesting conversation unfolded. But after a while, a bus of school kids shows up. And they're from Washington, D.C., and they are mixed race. I mean, there's, a very diverse group of students, probably maybe 10th or 11th grade, something like that. And
can I just pause you? Can you
Yeah.
tell folks who this monument is?
oh, sorry, Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you're not familiar, I think there are more monuments to Forrest than there are even to Robert E. Lee. He's one of the most celebrated figures among sort of neo-Confederates in our time because, I'll let you do the math, but he was a Confederate general. He's often praised for his strategic mastery, but he's really more famous as the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. And so this monument says on the pedestal, a couple of sort of clue character-like descriptions: untutored genius, etc., Wizard of the Saddle, which was his nickname, and that's where the term Grand Wizard came from, but it's like the connection is not laid out for you in the two double-sided historical markers that the UDC has put up in by his thing. So yeah, and to see one of these put up in 2001, I mean, the story gets even more bizarre. That's a fun one. But
I guess we can just say the story is in the book.
It is in the book.
It is in the
book. But where was I going with that? Oh, the school kids who came off. When the president of the United Daughters of the Confederacy was trying to give her spiel about Forrest, it's like they were not taking the bait at all. And it was like really kind of cool to see these young people. It's just like, we're not falling for that. And there was no like attempt to like push back or just be, it was just like, no. I mean, it was complete sort of impervious to this sort of propaganda. And I think some of that must have had to do with the fact of just being in the place. They had been in Selma with a tour guide who was, as it turns out, on the bridge, on the Pettus Bridge when she was 7 years old on Bloody Sunday. So that experience of like being in the place and then knowing someone or meeting someone like has a personal relationship to these places. You gotta identify yourself.
Yeah, we're about to get a softball, I think. I don't know about that.
My name is George Candler, and this is my dad, so.
Yeah, that deserves it.
How long did it take you to make this book?
That's a good one.
Which I think what you're asking, George, is where have you been for the last 9 years? That's a great question. I started writing it in 2018, right around the time I went to Montgomery, but really the book began in 1997 on the first trip that John and I took together, August 11th, 1997, the day after Johnny Cash's final concert in Atlanta. And so, how many? That's a long time. 27 years? Not all that was writing, but yeah, basically all of that kind of was work that went into the book.
And we'll do two more. These two in the front.
Hi, your sister was in my class at Westminster. I'm thunderstruck by what you're saying. I'm from Atlanta. I raised my two daughters in New York City, and I have fielded everything from mint juleps on the veranda on the platter to was your father in the Ku Klux Klan. I'm serious. So recently my youngest daughter and I went on a trip through South Carolina, big open beautiful fields and farms, and she rolls the window down and says, "What is that?" It was a Confederate flag. She said, "No, we have to turn around, I have to take a picture of it." Then we go a little bit further, and she sees this shack, and she said, "Yeah, Mom, that's where the slaves lived." These are my daughters, 40 and 45 years old, raised in New York City. So, preaching to the choir. Hallelujah. Thank you for your book.
Well, thank you. One thing I should say about that is that it's not just up to the students of history to do things differently, to experience history in place, on foot. It's also up to the teachers of history and the administrators of institutions that communicate or mediate public history. And one of the more remarkable changes in an institutional sense is the way what we used to call plantations as tourist destinations have, in some cases, the Whitney Plantation is the kind of model for this, that has turned the story around. So they tell the experience, or they tell the story of Whitney Plantation from the experience, insofar as they've been able to reconstruct it, of the enslaved people who lived there, not from and that is a good way of illustrating how the sort of narrative of history in general has changed a lot.
I have a softball and a curveball.
Okay. Uh-oh.
The softball, how are the public schools treating this today in the South?
Oh, that's the softball question? I'm not sure I want to. Can I?
But you went through all these various
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll give you an example from Selma. The last time I was actually recently in Selma, not even a month ago, with John Hardman over there. But on that trip in 2018, Selma is identified more than any other place with the civil rights movement. It's particularly the voting rights march, the Selma to Montgomery March, that phase of the civil rights movement. And if you go to, and isn't it strange that, like, of all the places to encounter the president of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, it's in Selma. It's not an accident. But the public school, Selma High School. So one of the things that you all know this, but one of the things that happened after Brown v. Board of Education was instead of integrating public schools, some white families started their own schools, their own private schools, known as SEG academies, of which there are still a lot, that you can usually find them by their mascot. They're still often called the Rebels. But that happened in Selma. And so the public high school, remember, like, this is like model sort of Selma equals civil rights movement. There is not a single white student at Selma High School, the public high school. So segregation it's maybe even worse than it was in 1965. I think it probably depends on it depends on the place. That's really the only direct experience I have with public schools in in the South, apart from like seeing the structural, the relative structural health or lack of health between the private schools and the public schools.
Okay, this is the easy one.
Oh, okay.
It's going to really test the knowledge base of those of you in a different way. The Germans have been trying to deal with the way in which they are dealing with the Holocaust, and the Japanese are still trying to deal with their attacks at Pearl Harbor and beyond. You are now describing how we are seeking to provide the truth about our past in terms of slavery and so much more. Are there any parallels that you see in the three pieces of world history that exist?
Well, there's one very specific one, and that is there was a really incredible book that came out a few years ago called Learning from the Germans, which is essentially taking this, like approaching the way the Germans have confronted their past and transformed sort of public spaces and all of this in a way that there is no attempt to whitewash this like really frank and honest confrontation. The woman who wrote that book is called Susan Naiman, and here's your connection. She's from Atlanta, and she's from a Jewish family, and I think she left Atlanta shortly after the temple bombing, and she had a personal experience of that episode. And so for her, like, to be able to connect, the temple bombing, the Holocaust, her experience as a Jewish woman and as a Southerner, and now I think it was published in like 2016 or something like that, right when all of the conversation about the Confederate monuments. I think the parallels are very close. And yeah. And Adam and I have talked about this a number of times. Like the versions of history that we got are always less interesting than the actual, the versions of history that were kept from us, or that were, I'm not suggesting there's some conspiracy. Well, sometimes there is, but sometimes it was also just learned over generations. This sort of, the deliberateness just became so sort of congenital. But it is, what was the word you used? Unnerving or bracing. That is definitely the case. And it's also highly liberating. And that's where that is where I want to leave this conversation, or point towards, because there is no life in falsehood. There is no future in falsehood. And while it may be difficult and bracing and painful to confront, and I don't mean just other people's history. For me, this book was always connected to my own personal history. And I don't just mean family history. I mean my own self. And so to be truthful about my family requires me to be truthful about myself, to things that don't necessarily have to do with Confederate monuments, things that have to do with the way I attempt to raise my children or attempt to be a good husband. And so that they are connected. So, but I found it to be the case that, yes, this experience it can often be really troubling, but it's also very freeing to be able to let go of things that are not true.
And please join me giving another round of applause to Adam and Pete for being here tonight.
This guy.
And thank you so much to all of you.